Hi everybody, Moe here. As a follow-up to my Second World War video that I covered back in May for the 80th anniversary, I thought I would follow up with a much bigger and expansive project. This is part 1 of our Scotland during the Cold War video. This is focusing more on the military aspects, while part 2 will focus mainly on the civilian life. I hope you guys enjoy this video. Scotland during this time period, much like the rest of the United Kingdom and its declining empire, suffered under the severe debt due to the war. By far, Scotland was relatively safe, mostly unharmed during the Blitz besides the key sites like Glasgow and Edinburgh. Scotland was a key for the industrial might of the empire, with various factories and shipyards across the two cities. During the 1945 UK general election, Labour suffered a massive landslide victory, beating out the Conservative Party and Winston Churchill, who was still the Prime Minister at the time, replacing him with Clement Attlee. While most of his policies were focused on the British nation as a whole, he also commenced decolonization, such as giving India its independence. But in 1949, Great Britain and various other key allied nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO. Other key factors include the establishment of Britain's own nuclear weapons program, which started in January of 1947 and commenced its first test in 1952. But by that time, Attlee had left the office. But during his time as Prime Minister, there were two main key wars that were happening in the early stages of the Cold War: the Korean War and the Malayan Emergency. Britain was in fact the second largest contributor of troops to the United Nations forces after the United States. This included three Scottish regiments, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, and famously the Black Watch. For the Malaya emergency, I would like to bring a special guest to the video. A friend of mine from Malaysia who goes by the name of Alex Malaysia. Anyhow, take it away.
All right, so we're going to be talking about the Malayan emergency here, otherwise known as the WW2 Malaya in Malay. So basically, how this happened is Malaya. It has been a British colony during the 19th century, including the strait settlements of Penang, Malacca, and Singapore, the federated Malay states, and the unfederated Malay states. During this time, they also imported many Chinese and Indians as laborers for their rubber plantations or tin mines. Later during the 1920s, communism spread into Malaya from China and in Indonesia, which would influence them, these workers, and they would soon form the Malayan Communist Party in 1930. Later in World War II, Japan invades Malaya, and this gave the rise to the Malayans People Anti-Japanese Army, which is formed by the MCP, the Malayan Communist Party, and became one of the main resistance force against the Japanese during the Second World War. Later, after the Second World War, after a few economic disruptions, the MCP continued their anti-colonial and anti-British activities against the British government in Malaya, especially their protests against the forming of the Malayan Union in 1947. Later, in 16th of June 1948, in Sungai Siput, Perak, three European rubber plantation managers were killed by communists in their estates, which would be known as the Sungai Siput incident. All right. So later, the British will station more of their forces alongside with Commonwealth forces in Malaya, including nations like Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, Kenya, New Zealand, and Rhodesia, and more of them. But our focus will be on the Scottish regiments for later. But still, let me continue here. So in 1949, the MCP leader, Chin Peng, would form the Malayan National Liberation Army, otherwise known as the MNLA, and starting a guerrilla war against the British, including sabotaging their infrastructure, plantations, etc. And later in 1950, April, General Sir Harold Briggs, a former veteran in the Burma campaign, comes up with the Briggs Plan. All right, so for the Briggs Plan, what is their motive is winning the hearts of the civilians. So basically, they want to separate the guerrillas from the civilian supporters. Basically, how they do it is they built concentration camps known as the Xingchun, the new villages. They relocated most of the civilians, the villagers, to and also deporting any communist sympathizers, especially the Chinese. Later in 1951, 6th of October, British High Commissioner in Malaya said Sir Henry Gurney would be assassinated near Fraser's Hill during an ambush by the MNLA. Then later in the next year, on January, General Templer would become the High Commissioner of Malaya, starting the Templar Plan, which is about strengthening British and Commonwealth forces in Malaya. And they use plenty of warfare types, such as using chemical warfare and psychological warfare. Later in 1955, on 28th of December, a few people would try to negotiate peace with the MCP, including later First Prime Minister of Malaya, Tunku Abdul Rahman, David Marshall, the leader of Singapore during the time, and Tan Cheng Lock, representing the MCA, the Malayan Chinese Association, with Chen Peng and a few other members. However, the negotiations were unsuccessful, so then later Chen Peng would soon retire to Thailand after the talks. Later, the MCP would retreat to the Malayan-Thai border to continue their activities. On 3rd of July 1960, the government of the Federation of Malaya, which they gained independence in 1957, will declare an end to the Malayan imminency.
Thank you very much to Alex Malaysian on his talk on the Malaysian emergency. Now we go back to Scotland itself. For starters, RAF Lossiemouth was changed to HMS Fulmar in 1946, mainly for naval aircraft. During the 1950s, Britain expanded upon its nuclear deterrence system and introduced the V-Bomber Strike Force, comprising of three main bombers, the Vickers Valiant, the Avro Vulcan, and the Handley Page Victor. We also saw the production of the Conqueror Mark II in Dalmuir, Scotland. It was a variant of the Carnarvon which saw over 100 being built, with most being stationed in the British Army of Orion's tank squadrons. Alongside that was the establishment of the Northern Army Group, otherwise known as NORFAG, which was a NATO military formation comprising of 4 Western European army groups. This included the British, which obviously included some Scottish regiments, such as the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, the Scots Guards, the Black Watch, the Royal Scots, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, and lastly the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. Those were the most recognizable groups in regards to what Norfhag had at the time, but also included territorial army battalions such as the 1st Battalion 52nd Lowland Volunteers and the 2nd Battalion 51st Highland Volunteers. And lastly, for our 1950s talks, included the abolition of national service and the Suez Crisis, which several regiments were involved in the invasion of the Suez Canal zone. The 1960s. What a time to be alive. We have the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, and other famous incidences during this time. But as for Scotland, it was much worse. Driven by deep cuts to the UK's defence budget, the 1960s was arguably the most turbulent and defining decade in terms of the traditional Scottish regiments. Following the end to national service and budget reviews, the Seaforth Highlanders, alongside the Queen's Own Cameron's Highlanders, were merged to form the Queen's Own Highlanders. But by far the biggest blunder was the 1968 Defence Review, which saw the disbandment of the Cameronians Scottish Rifles, a lowland regiment dating back to 1689, but was disbanded. This was the only British infantry regiment to be disbanded, rather than amalgamated as part of the cuts. The Scots Guards were reduced from 2 regular battalions, now only to 1. But not all was doom and gloom. In fact, there was a planned disbandment of the Argylls that was averted due to immense political and public pressure. Majority of the credit was thanks to its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Connell Mitchell, otherwise known as Mad Mitch, during the Aden Emergency. For stars for our complex talk is the Aden Emergency, which lasted between 1963 to 1967, which was an armed rebellion led mainly by the National Liberation Front of Yemen versus the British and the Federation of South Arabia. The outcome of this rebellion was a Yemeni NLF victory and a total British withdrawal and the independence of South Yemen. And here's the list of what Scottish regiments fought in this conflict. Let's go to our next one, being the Borneo Confrontation. This lasted between 1963 to 1966, where a combined coalition of the Commonwealth of Nations, which included the United Kingdom, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Australia, and New Zealand versus Indonesia, and various other communist parties. The outcome of this conflict was a Commonwealth victory. I personally can describe it as Britain's own Vietnam War going on at the time, considering on how close it was to the actual Vietnam War that was happening in Southeast Asia at the time. And our last conflict of the 1960s was the Cyprus peacekeeping missions. A common role of the British Armed Forces during the latter half of the Cold War was peacekeeping, and this was one of the major operations. Units such as the Royal Highland Fusiliers served alongside the UN in peacekeeping operations. And finally was the deployment of British troops in Northern Ireland. This was during the time of the Troubles. Also during this time period was the deployment of US naval forces, specifically submarines, in the Holy Loch region nearby to Faslane. Famously, in 1968, a pilot from No. 1 Squadron, occupying a Hawker Hunter, made an unexpected flyby across the Tower Bridge, going right through it. This was due to the outrage that RAF's 50th birthday wasn't happening due to the extensive budget cuts at this time. And finally, the survivability of the V Force, as in the Bomber Strike Force, was highly questionable, and in 1968 the Royal Navy took charge over the nuclear deterrence role, using the UGM submarine launched ballistic missiles. And then, of course, for much more tactical nukes was the Seppacat, Jaguar, and the Tornado. Now we are moving on to the 1970s period. The 1970s marked a turning point in Scottish regiments, transitioning entirely away from their old imperial roles, becoming the main spearheads for two main commitments for the British Army. We will be talking about the continuation of Norfag, which is the Northern Army Group of Germany, and the demanding internal security role of Northern Ireland during the Troubles. It was an ethno-nationalist conflict in Northern Ireland which lasted from the late 1960s to 1998, where it ended on the Good Friday Agreement. During this intense conflict was an intense rotation of the various Scottish infantry battalions, including the Royal Scots, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, the Black Watch, the Royal Highland Fusiliers, the Queen's Own Highlanders, and the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, but also saw an armoured deployment from the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, but served primarily in the early development of the conflict in a variety of roles. But the British Army at this time was much more geared to conventional mechanized warfare in preparation for an all-out war against the Warsaw Pact, and had suffered hundreds of casualties due to the asymmetrical warfare in street fighting. For our main talk about Norfag, or the Northern Army Group, it was well maintained in preparation in case of a Warsaw Pact attack from eastern Germany. Scottish regiments rotated through their bases in West Germany, which included armoured, mechanized, and infantry battalions in preparation for a high-intensity conflict in the North Germany plain. But various regiments were also trained under the Ace Mobile Role Training, which was a key rapid deployment force in preparation of an unlikely Soviet offensive in a NATO region that wasn't heavily guarded, such as the northern part of Norway or the border with Turkey. A famous unit that took part in this exercise training was the Royal Scots, which demanded intensive winter training. And finally was the 1971 Cavalry amalgamation, with the Royal Scots Greys were amalgamated with the 3rd Carabiniers to form the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, Carabiniers and the Greys, which was the final major amalgamation for a senior Scottish regiment in the 20th century until the large-scale changes of the 1990s to the 2000s. This was due to the 1975 Mason Defence Review, which by the end of it saw no further Scottish infantry regiments were no longer disbanded or amalgamated at that time. This decade was an operational overstretch for the Scottish military, where various units trained in high-stakes nuclear-era training in Germany and the current insurgency going on in Northern Ireland. Now then, we go to the 1980s. The 1980s was regarded as the main decade for the Cold War. Such famous events of this decade included the fall of the Berlin Wall, the war in Afghanistan by the Soviets, and the strengthened ties of both Britain and the United States under US President Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher of the United Kingdom. Starting off the list was John McAleese, who was famously part of the SAS unit in charge of the Iranian siege embassy in May of 1980. Next on our list is the Falklands War. This short conflict was the most defining event for the British Army during this decade, where the British Navy and Army engaged the Argentinian forces to claim back their territory. The Scots Guards, primarily the 2nd Battalion, were part of the 5th Infantry Brigade, where they fought the decisive battle on Mount Tumbleton, which was one of the final and fiercest engagements leading up to the Argentine surrender. This battle resulted in the loss of 8 Scots Guardsmen and 43 wounded. The Royal Scots Dragoon Guards were also part of the war, but mainly for reconnaissance in the South Atlantic. Famously during this conflict, the Avro Vulcan XM597 took part in the Black Buck raid and was retired to East Fortune, home to the Museum of Light in Scotland. This was the very last combat mission of the B-Bomber Force. And as continuation, the Royal Scottish Dragoons Guards and various other infantry units rotated through their permanent posting in West Germany as part of the 1st British Corps of Norfolk. They maintained a high level of readiness, training to fight a very heavy mechanized battle against the Warsaw Pact on the North German plain. And alongside this was the continuation of the Troubles, where units such as the Black Watch, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and various others cycled through 6 months of touring to counter the insurgency going on in Northern Ireland. Besides key military operations, the post-Falklands military budget had actually stabilized and there were no amalgamations or disbandments of any Scottish infantry regiments during the 1980s. And lastly, we have the 1990s. The 1990s saw the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had a profound and immediate effect on the structure of the British Army at the time, where it had to redefine its purpose and size, which resulted in various deep and highly controversial military cuts. We saw the end of the Norfolk and the British Army of the Rhine, where various Scottish regiments were now being pulled back into Scotland itself, with a new focus on not large-scale, high-intense static warfare, but rather smaller expeditionary peacekeeping operations around the world. Alongside this time, in 1998 was the end to the Troubles with the Good Friday Agreement. Operation Granby, which was also part of Operation Desert Storm during the Gulf War period, saw the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, now equipped with their brand new Challenger class of tanks, took part in the decisive armored thrust into Ukraine, achieving one of the largest tank battles of the conflict. Scottish infantry units were also heavily involved in peacekeeping and stabilization missions in the former Yugoslavian countries, serving multiple tours in Bosnia and Kosovo. But all was not about key military operations, as we saw the final amalgamations. In 1991 was the Scots Guards. Their 2nd Battalion was put into suspended ammunition, reduced to a company size, effectively ending its service as a full fighting unit. And in 1994, 2 historic Highland regiments were formed into a single unit. This marked the disbandment of the Gordon Highlanders, which was its own separate entity after 113 years. now being part of the Highlanders, Seaforth Gordons, and Camerons. To anyone who has made it through this entire video, thank you all for taking your time and enjoyment of this historical video. Part 2 is also up currently as of now, which talks about the civilian life of Scotland itself. Thanks to various exhibitions going on, I was able to learn a bit more about my country's history during this time, and I hopefully that you guys all learned something brand new. Alongside this, I would like to thank you all for a successful 2025 in terms of content creation. I have never seen much level of subscribers on this channel before. I've only in my younger channels where I used to have like a bunch of subscribers following me, but hot damn, more than 250. Probably by the time of this recording, we are currently recording it on the 15th of November, we may end up having 300 subscribers by now. And I would like to thank you all for an amazing 2025. I have a bunch of new projects lined up for 2026, and I hope I can share them all. Once again, thank you. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, or even subscribe if you are a new viewer.
Mess with us again. We stocked our ships full of British beer and bullets. We mobilised the Navy and we called up the Marines. We sailed 2 weeks